So today we have Professor Joan Hubert. She's a music professor here at TSU, and she's going to answer some questions today about the civil rights era. First and foremost, during which years did you attend college, and also what did you study at that particular college?
I entered Prairie View A&M. At that time it was college instead of university. Prairie View A&M College in 1964, September. And I finished with a bachelor's in arts, BA in music in 69 because it was a 5-year course. And I went straight through to get my master's in music also. So I finished that in 71. During that time, I got a job teaching. So I was going to school and working in Waco, so I would commute from Waco to Prairie View to get my master's. And during that time, I will remember that, I do remember that it was kind of a hard thing because Interstate 290 was not as beautiful as it is now. So that was a hard thing. And then I went back in 76 to get certified for, it was education. I already had a lot of education on my transcript, but I went back to get certified in elementary education so that I could take a job as an elementary teacher. And so from 72 until, I guess, 7 years later, I taught elementary everything.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel that attending an HBCU was essential in helping you understand what was going on during that era?
Oh, yes. I think so because at that time, HBCUs, and even now, they're a nurturing university. They take students, and when I say students, at that time it was like black students. And now it's everybody. In fact, I remember when I was at Prairie View, the first Hispanic student who came through was Hilda Soto. And she was rather out of it because she thought she was not going to be accepted. But she was a minority, so she was in with other minorities, and it got to be a very good thing. But it was a nurturing place where whatever you were good at doing, they enhanced that educationally. And they took you sometimes one-on-one if they had to, and especially in music. And I wanted to be an opera singer, so I got a lot of opportunities that may not have been afforded other people, but by going to an HBCU. Yes.
So, were there any significant moments that happened during your tenure at Prairie View?
Oh yeah, I remember my mother told me during the civil rights movement, she says, I didn't send you to Prairie View to get arrested or anything like that because we were having marches in Waller. In Waller, Texas, and in Hempstead, you could not go to any of the stores and sit down and get a soda or a hamburger or whatever. And when you did go to the stores, you had to go through the back door. So usually we wouldn't go to the stores. But this particular time, they had a march to Hempstead. And I had a big afro. I mean, I was Angela Davis in the I thought I was. Anyway, I had a big afro and I was very militant. You know, I had learned how to be militant. And we marched all the way from Prairie View almost to Hempstead. And I saw the TV cameras. And I realized if my mother sees me on television, that'll be the end of my college career because she'll make me come home. So I kind of tipped out of the line. So I didn't get to complete that march. I hate that because that was an historical march where they did go and sit in the Woolworths. They stopped the traffic and everything. And I was back in the dormitory when all the cameras started rolling. And my mother asked me about it and I said, I don't know what you're talking about.
Wow, that's awesome. So concerning the fact that you are a music major, I can imagine that you had many interactions with people of other racial backgrounds. Could you explain to me how those interactions were concerning the time frame?
Well, yes, I did, and especially since I wanted to be an opera singer. Back in the day when I was much smaller and my voice was much higher, I was Pamina in the Magic Flute. And Dr. Robert A. Henry was my voice teacher. He was a very forward-thinking conductor, music teacher, voice teacher, and he had the Houston Symphony to come to Prairie View to accompany us in a full opera. We had costumes, settings, everything. And the orchestra did not believe that we were going to rise to the occasion. They were very reluctant, to play, but they had been conscripted, they had been paid, so they had to do that. But they kind of gave negative, auras, I guess you could say, for playing for us. But it came to, they came to their senses once we started, that we were serious, and they had to rise to that occasion where they had to really play, as we made them. And it was an excellent performance, if I may say so.
Okay, that's awesome. Quick question. So after all, everyone was fighting for equal rights in the civil rights movement. However, being that you were a college student at the time, I must ask how others felt around you while you were in Prairie View, like your fellow students.
Well, I have to say that the majority of us were very militant. We wanted to be able to do things, so we loved the civil rights movement, because when we would travel with the choir, we took a tour every February, 2 weeks tour. They called it our orchestral arts. The orchestra did it, and the concert choir had a tour. And we would have to stay in houses because there were no hotels that would welcome us, and in those days. And we felt that was rather, that was different, although we had been used to not living in hotels, but we took offense at that. So most of us around, especially in the music building, we were on one accord. We wanted to have better things that happened at Prairie View. We wanted better things to happen in Hempstead and in Waller County. So we kind of did what we could as a militant person. And we did do some changes. We had some changes. We wanted to be able to vote,
right,
and they would not allow us to vote, even though we were there 5 years, for pursuing our education. But that's now changed because of other Prairie View students.
So considering that Prairie View is like in a secluded area, let's say, did you feel that the state tried to hinder y'all from voting?
Oh, of course. It might not have been the state itself, because I can't put it on Texas, but it was the government, the local government, who did stop us completely. And they used the federal government as an excuse. They said, you can't vote because it's not in the federal government's archives, their laws. And they stopped us from voting, even though we all had a voter's registration thing, because, back in those days, that's when it was really got to be a big thing for you to vote as an African American.
Right.
And they just denied us. We'd go to the polls and they wouldn't let us in. We'd try to register, they wouldn't let us do it. But we'd do it every year, religiously.
Right. So another question I have. Do you remember any significant events where you faced outright racism personally, and did you think that it affected you as an individual?
Well, there were a lot of events where I was discriminated against because of the color of my skin. I know when I went to Houston Grand Opera, it was different because at that time, I think there was only one other African American woman who had been accepted into, and that was Brenda Wimberly, who was accepted into the chorus at Houston Grand Opera. And then when I came along, it was accepted. They thought that I was going to be an alto, a mezzo, and at that time I was a coloratura. And so when I sang, then they had to give me, they didn't have to, but they gave me the first soprano, seating with the first sopranos and the chorus. And for 5 years, part of the time, I was there for almost 20, but for 5 of those years, I was the only black female there. And then when we did Showboat, they needed more African Americans. So that's a form of discrimination because they didn't have enough to make up the Showboat crew cast. So they asked me about my friends who were capable, and I gave them names, and they hired 18 more people in the chorus. So that was a form of discrimination that was the nicest one that I'll tell you about. There were others where it would make your hair stand on edge, so I'll keep that one.
So so after you graduated from Prairie View, I remember you mentioned that you became a music teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So as a choir director, did you face any racial tension at events such as the UIL?
Oh yes. Now I started in La Vega, and in La Vega, right outside of Waco, I was their very first choir director. And in fact, there were only 3 African Americans in the school. One of them was a custodian, the other was a math teacher, and me. And I had one student, I won't say his name, but I do remember his name very well because of what happened after. He called me the N-word every morning. When I would walk in class, I have a habit of saying good morning. And all of the other students would say, some of them would say good morning, maybe. But some of them would look at me, because it was an all-white school. Right. And this one student would say, good morning, N-word, and I would remind him, I'm not that, and I don't want to have to turn you in. I was trying to be diplomatic instead of being militant. But it ended up where he was killed accidentally. I'll never forget that. And his parents came to me and apologized for condoning his behavior. And that's one thing that stands out in my mind from my history. And there were other things too that happened, but that's the one thing. And then when I went to Lamarck, I was their first African American choir director again at the high school. And there were maybe 200 kids in the choir. And when I got there, 160 of them boycotted because they didn't want a N-word, there. And I stayed, and they said, are you going to stay? And I said, yes. That doesn't bother me. They're the ones who are going to lose because I have a lot to give. And it ended up after the first semester, and they saw I wasn't going to go away. I was like a bad sore. And then by the next semester, I had more. And I ended up, by the end of the next year, I had 160 in my choir. And going to UIL with a bunch of white students, we were discriminated against because of me, but the kids all saw what was happening. We could not get a 1 for a choir, and we were very good, but they would always give us a 2 or a 3. But we just smiled, and I had explained to them, because your choir director is black, we have to deal with it. And the kids all said, hey. And there were other things that happened. I had the KKK to put out a hit on me.
Oh my God.
Down there in Lamarck, it was outside of Alvin. They put a $25,000 hit on me because I had the first I had a Black History program, and I used white kids in it. So the KKK wanted me to be gone, but I stayed there 20 years.
That's awesome. So one last question for you. Considering the present day issues going on, such as the outcome of the 2016 election and police brutality, what advice would you give young adults as they prepare for their future careers in higher education?
One thing I would say to anybody who is a younger person, do not let the timbre of the world color you to the point where you give up. You always present yourself as being capable, and then you pursue the education so that when you say I'm capable, you can prove it by doing it, actually being able to do it. You dress, there's this old thing about dress for success. Now, I'm not dressed today, this is Friday, but dress for success. I don't mean you have to have a suit and tie and coat on, all the time. But you dress so that when people look at you, they get a different perception of who you are. I know that's awful to say, because who you are is you in your mind. But you want them to see you in a different way. So you dress not according to the hip-hop way, but you dress so that people will remember, this is what he looked like all the time, or she looked like all the time. And you speak clearly. Use good English. That's bad to say, but use correct English. Pursue that. You don't have to use lingo language, all the time. Especially if it's in a business setting. you want to give your best front so that people will hire you. And then in your class, I'm always mindful, you don't know who's sitting in your class. They may be the next president, and you want them to hire you when you finish. So you give them the impression that you are smart, capable, and you're willing and able, innovative, you're going to work and do things. And that's how you're going to be successful. It's worked for me.
And we can see right now. So one last thing I want to ask you about. I remember in class you mentioned that you wrote to the newspaper in Galveston.
No, I wrote a proposal. I'm a very, let's say, I do things. My mother worries about me, but I wrote a proposal to the Galveston Historical Foundation. And I told them that Galveston was a slave port, and we needed to have a Middle Passage marker in Galveston. There is no marker for the Middle Passage west of the Mississippi. New Orleans is they're trying to get one, but I think Galveston's going to beat them. And I wrote a proposal and said, we need to remember the Middle Passage. That's a part that, as African Americans, we know slavery, we know the civil rights struggle, we know all of those things, but we forget about the millions who were lost coming in that transatlantic slave trade. And when I first went to Africa, I stood on the Gulf of Guinea, and these voices, I'm not crazy, but some people think so, but these voices said, remember us, remember me, remember us. And I realized these were people who were lost in the Middle Passage. And so I started then, I said, I'm never going to forget them. And when I wrote the proposal, they at first told me, no, we are not. But I did convince them, and after we did a little history, and I showed them that I was really serious. We will now have a Middle Passage marker. It's already been designed. We're putting the language on it, and it's going to be planted on June 10th of 2017. And we're going to have a program on that day. They're going to plant it early in the morning. We have a program in the afternoon, and then we have another program, a celebration at the end of the night. So I'm planning all of that. The celebration at the top, Galveston Historical Foundation will do the ceremony part. And they've paid for it. It is an awesome task to do. But I am very happy with GHF that they have taken this. This is a dream of mine, and they're making it come true. So I've got that.
That is awesome. I can't wait.
June 10th. They're going to put it in the newspaper very soon. And between January and June, this is going to bring in the June 19th, Juneteenth celebrations. But between January and June 10th, they're going to have, I've convinced them just the other day, we need to have workshops on the Middle Passage. And they have said, yes, we will. So they're going to bring in speakers, and of course, I haven't forgotten about Texas Southern, our history department.
Yes, excellent.
So they'll hear from them. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, honey, for
really
thinking about me.
appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay.